Great.
So Professor Hurley, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. A few years ago, I had the advantage of being able to take a trip to Egypt, and it was really impressive. Some of the ruins there are in better condition than practically any ruins that you'll find anywhere in the world, Greek, Roman, or whatever. And if you're able to go to the Valley of the Kings, for example, and you go into some of the caves that were tombs of the ancient pharaohs, you'll see paintings on the walls that look like they were done just yesterday. Absolutely amazing. So after I got back, I really was interested in furthering my education, of what happened in ancient Egypt back then. And I focused especially on religion, because I happened to be interested in religion from, before I left, before I went to Egypt. So it just provided the opportunity, the trip provided the opportunity for me to look deeper into this phenomenon. And I was especially interested in the gods of ancient Egypt. And the question I had, first of all, was why are there so many gods? To start out with, in ancient Egypt, well, first of all, let me say that ancient Egypt has a history of about 3,000 years, and it goes back to a pharaoh called King Narmer, which was about 3100 BC, so about 5,000 years ago from now. And it goes forward in time about 3,000 years to the last pharaoh, who was a woman, Queen Cleopatra, which everybody I think has heard of. And if you go back in time to about the time of King Narmer, 3000 BC, there were only a handful of gods and just a very few priests and a couple temples. And when you move forward in time 3,000 years, there were over 1,000 gods and tens of thousands of priests and hundreds of temples. But where did they all come from? Where did the gods all come from? And why are there so many priests at the end of this period? And it didn't take too much analysis to figure out that the priests created the gods, okay? And every god who became prominent needed a temple, of course, and so that's the way it went. The more priests, the more temples, the more priests, the more gods, the more gods, the more temples, the more temples, the more priests, because every temple needed a priest, and the more priests, the more gods, and so on. So the priests created the gods needed a temple, and that's kind of the causal chain, the way it worked. And why did this happen? Why were there so many gods? And I think the answer is because it made the priests powerful. You got to realize that the all-consuming obsession of the ancient Egyptians was an afterlife. They desired an afterlife constantly, and that's what led them, to create these incredible structures like the pyramids. When you look at the movies, you find a handful of slaves, or not a handful, but thousands of slaves, working night and day and building these pyramids, under the cruel lash of a taskmaster who works for the pharaoh. And but that's largely not the way it was. The pyramids were really created by ordinary Egyptians. And why did they work night and day, not 365 days of the year? Because part of the time they were engaged in agriculture, which is the way Fresno operates. But they were engaged in agriculture for part of the year anyway. But the rest of the year they spent working on these pyramids. And why did they do it? Because the pharaoh said, I will get you into the afterlife if you will build this pyramid for me, and this pyramid is going to be my tomb, okay? So that's why they did it, in order to get into the afterlife. And the priests, picked up on this right away. Well, this is wonderful. We can make a killing this way. We can tell the people that we are engaged with the gods. We bargain with the gods. The gods do whatever we want. So if you will just build these pyramids and all these other structures, the caves, the caverns that were the burial places of the pharaohs and so on, we will guarantee you that you will get into the afterlife. Okay? And the pharaoh, of course, is the highest of high priests. He was involved in it too. So the whole operation worked for the purpose of getting the people into the afterlife. And they were con artists then, if you like to call them that. And the whole country operated that way. It's really quite extraordinary. So the last question we might ask, did these gods really exist? And I don't think it takes a lot of thought to think, no, these gods were just creations of the priests for the purpose of making the priests powerful. At the end of the period, at the end of the 3,000-year period of ancient history of ancient Egypt, the priests were the most powerful component of society, and they were the wealthiest, and because the whole country worked for the priests, basically. So I think the answer probably is no. These gods didn't really exist. They're just constructs put together by the priests at the blessing of the pharaoh. And that's an incredible state of affairs, I think. So I think the answer probably is no. They're fictions, they're illusions, and the belief that they existed were illusions. And this illusion is one of the most famous in the history of the world. It lasted for 3,000 years. Amazing. So then I asked myself, I'm sorry, I guess we should have had that other screen up there. So these are the items basically that I covered. Gods were in control of the afterlife, the priests were in control of the gods. So the priests were really in control of the afterlife, and did they really exist? I think probably the answer is no. So then I thought to myself, well, if you move forward in time, I should say backward in time, if you move backward in time, can you find this sort of a thing going on earlier? So did the ancient Egyptians make up this business, or did it have a history to it? And the answer that I found is that it really had a history to it. And it goes back really as far back as 10,000 BC or 12,000 years from now. If you go back to the Neolithic period, you find people doing basically the same thing. The problem is, in order to research this subject, it was a little bit difficult because the history of writing only goes back about 3,500 BC at the very earliest. So where do you find evidence? And there's a couple of anthropologists that helped me out a lot. One of them was Edward Burnett Tyler. He died in 1917, and a follower of his, James George Fraser, died in 1941. Tyler wrote a book called Primitive Culture, and he focuses on the subject of animism. And it's a very large, it's a 2-volume book. Each volume is about 500 pages, as long as you get 1,000 pages together. And he researches this topic of animism, and he finds that this is the dominant pattern, of ancient peoples going back thousands and thousands of years. People then believed that everything had a spirit associated with it. That's what you mean by animism. So it was a spirit of the clouds, a spirit of the rain, a spirit of the sun, a spirit of the seeds in the ground, and all of these spirits were in control of the crops. So it didn't take long for some innovative characters to think, well, spirits communicate. I can communicate. Why don't I communicate with the spirits? And I can persuade them to produce a super good crop. And that's what they did. They persuaded their followers, look, I can communicate with these spirits, and I can guarantee, that you'll have a good crop if you'll just pay me. That's all it takes. And of course, nobody really can control, the rain and the sun. So these clever individuals had to be good prognosticators. They had to be able to see, it looks like we got a good year for corn, maybe a good year for wheat. And if we just tell the people, you see what a good job I did, you have a bumper crop. So they paid them. They paid them a great deal. They maybe became the chief of the tribe. At least they got the best mating opportunities, the best living conditions. They got power and all sorts. They got wealth. So these were the first priests. Okay, and it didn't take very long before these first priests figured out, why don't we convert the spirits of the seeds, the spirits of the cloud, the spirits of the rain, and so why don't we convert them to gods? Which they did. We'll be more powerful if we could convert the spirits to gods. Because anybody that can talk to gods is better than somebody who can talk to spirits. So that's exactly what happened. And that's the beginning of religion. And it goes back, as I said, a long, long time, 12,000 years from now. Priests bargained with the gods. Do these early gods exist? I don't think so. The product of these creative characters, who just persuaded the people that they could communicate with the gods for the purpose of the people and for the benefit of the people in the community. People in the community then rewarded them. So it didn't happen. It didn't begin with the ancient Egyptians and went back in history a long, long ways. So what is it? Then I figured, well, what happened after the Egyptians? Well, did this process continue? And yes, it did. As a lot of people probably know, the founder, I think you can properly say the founder of Judaism, was Moses. Judaism claims that it had very ancient people by the name of Abraham and Joseph and Isaac, and they were really the founders. No, it didn't. Our researchers these days in religion pretty much have concluded that there was never any Abraham, there was never any Joseph. They were just added for the purpose of giving pedigree to the ancient Jewish religion. So the first one, really of any importance, is Moses, and a lot of people claim that even Moses didn't exist. He's just a product of fiction. But I think he probably did, because there's one event that's really closely associated with Moses, and that's the Exodus. And if there's any reason to think that there was an Exodus, well then maybe there was a reason to think that there was a Moses. Now there's not much reason to think that there was an Exodus, because archaeologists have gone to work on this, and they have looked for evidence, high and low, for any group of people, a large group of people traveling from the eastern Nile Delta. That's where they would have started. The eastern Nile Delta, there was a large group of Hebrews that lived there, especially the Levites lived there. And if anything, they would have started from there. Now there's a couple of routes that they could have taken. They could have taken the coastal route, if you have any sense of geography. The eastern Nile Delta is on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and the Nile flows into the Mediterranean. And there's a huge delta consisting of marshland, mainly in those days. And they would have started from there, and they could have proceeded along the coastline up to Canaan, which is a little couple hundred miles, 150 miles, something like that. And that would have been the shortest route, but it probably wouldn't have been a good idea to do that, because the Egyptians had forts every 20 miles or so, and the soldiers in the forts probably would have interfered with any large group of people, traveling north. And certainly the Egyptians, who wrote down everything, and they did. They made lists on papyrus. They made grocery lists, and you can still find them, And so they wrote down everything. The soldiers in charge of the fortresses along the Mediterranean would have made a record of any large group of people traveling from the eastern Nile Delta up to Canaan. Canaan is approximately the area occupied by current Israel. So the thinking is they probably did not take a coastal route. They took an inland route through a town called Kadesh Barnea. And there's some reason to think that if it did happen, it happened around through Kadesh Barnea, which is about halfway. If you take an inland route up to Canaan through eastern Jordan, that's where you would have gone. So archaeologists have searched this area high and low. They've sifted the sand, with practically everything they could that they could use, and not a single trace, not a tiniest bit of evidence of any large group of people going through there could be found. And they would have left something. How long were they traveling? Well, if you read the Bible, they were going for 40 years. And how many people were there? Over 2.5 million, if you include everybody, including parents and children and soldiers and the whole works. Nothing could be found. Children lose toys, along the way. There wasn't a single toy to be found. Soldiers break weapons. Not a single weapon. Hunters have spears and that sort of thing. Not a single broken spear. Nothing. Okay? And they say, well, sandstorms could have buried them and that sort of thing. No, not for that many people. So then a man by the name of Friedman, who wrote a book on this, said, well, the exodus, if it happened, was probably a lot smaller, and it took a shorter period of time. Well, how much smaller? Well, he doesn't really give a number to it. But I would say if there was an exodus, it would have to have been large enough to have attracted Moses, who was an Egyptian priest, okay, and probably a military leader. It would have to have been large enough to attract his interest. So 100 people, 200 people, maybe something like, not 2.5 million, maybe 100, a couple hundred people, something like that. That's what I would guess. And how long would it have taken? Well, the Pharaoh marched soldiers from the eastern delta. Granted, he took the coastal route, but it took about 2 weeks to get, let's say, 100,000 soldiers from the eastern delta up to Canaan. So if you took an inland route, it probably would have taken a little bit longer, because the coastal route, was well traveled, and there was a road actually. So let's suppose it took 4 weeks or something like that, instead of 40 years. Let's suppose it took 4 weeks. The group could have gone to Kadesh Barnea, which is an oasis about midway along the path. They could have replenished their water supply. They could have taken enough food to last them all through the entire route. They could have taken enough water to get them to Kadesh Barnea, and then they could have replenished their water supply, and then they could have traveled up to the eastern bank of Jordan, crossed the Jordan River, and they've gotten into Canaan. They could have done it that way. So you've got a much smaller group of people traveling for a much shorter period of time. If there was an exodus, that's probably how it happened. Now, what did Moses have to do in order to get these people to go? And he had to promise them something. He had to promise them that they would be the teachers of the Hebrews that already lived in the Canaan region. And that's what he did. What would they teach them? What would they teach them? Religion. They're going to have a new God in order for this thing to work, and a single God, if that's really going to go. I think what happened then, Moses, who was a priest, and Freud, incidentally, the psychologist, thinks the same thing. Moses came upon this Pharaoh, whose name was Akhenaten. Has anybody ever heard of Akhenaten? Philip Glass, the opera writer, wrote an opera, and they did it in New York a couple of years ago. Very interesting. He was the only person, the only Pharaoh that had a single God going for him. So this is the only instance in the entire history of ancient Egypt where we had monotheism. As I said, we had over 1,000 gods at the end of this period. But for one brief period of about 15 years, the Egyptians were monotheists. And why were they monotheists? Because they had this Pharaoh who was crazy as a bedbug. His name was Akhenaten, and he invented a new god, which he called the Aten, A-T-E-N, and he used that god to replace all the other gods. And of course, this drove the people crazy, because the people depended, and this was something that's not very well understood, I think. People depended on this multiplicity of gods to get into the afterlife. And they were obsessed with the afterlife. And you had to have a whole bunch of gods in order for somebody to get there. There had to be gods in order to conduct a little trial of the soul, when it left the body. And they had to ask questions of the soul. Did you commit sins and anything like that? Did you steal from anybody? Did you tell lies to anybody? They had to ask those questions of the soul, and the soul, the departing soul, would have to say, no, I didn't do any of those things, I lived a good life. And then you had to have gods that would pass judgment. And then you have to have gods that will lead the soul all the way through the afterlife, and across the rivers, and up and down the valleys, and that sort of thing. It was very, very colorful. And so a whole battery of gods had to do this. The whole afterlife came to a halt if all the gods were absorbed by one God who didn't give a hoot about the afterlife. This one God, the Aten, was concerned with benefits in this life. There are famous bas-reliefs, images, made in stone of this God who was represented by the sun. He was a variant of the sun god, Re, and he's depicted as showering the pharaoh with benefits, with hands. There are these rays that come from the sun, and they end in little hands. Hands, provide benefits in this life. So that's what Akhenaten, the pharaoh, was interested in. He was interested in benefits in this life, and the people, as a result, hated this man. He was the most hated pharaoh in the entire history of ancient Egypt. And when he died, his son was King Tut, which you've probably heard of King Tut. They did everything they could, the successor pharaohs, everything they could to erase images of Akhenaten. And he of course, was an egomaniac. He had images of himself set up all over Egypt. And if you go through Egypt, you can see these images. The faces have been chiseled out, they've been erased. So that's what succeeding pharaohs tried to do. They reinstated all the gods. They did everything they could to get rid of Akhenaten, and the people were then happy. They had their afterlife back. They had their gods. They loved their gods. They had their gods back, and everybody, they had forgotten about the Aten and Akhenaten. And this was the case for 3,000 years. Okay, he was erased. His image, and he wasn't mentioned on the list of pharaohs. So nobody had any idea that he even existed, except in this marvelous time. In 1887, there were a bunch of letters that were discovered. They're called the Amarna letters, and they give evidence that this pharaoh, Akhenaten, existed at one time, and there was a god called the Aten, and that god existed. And that the notice that those letters were discovered came to Freud's attention, Freud the psychologist. And he said, oh my goodness, this is amazing, And he thought that this god, the Aten, looked so similar to the god of the Jews. Freud, of course, was a Jew. And he wondered, is it possible that this is really the same god, And I think the answer is yes. He concluded, yes, it is. So the God of the Jews, who's named Yahweh, is really the Aten, having been given a different name, a new name. And and this was done by Moses. So what did Moses do? He discovered that there was this very minor God figure called Yahweh, and he said, I'll take that God, and I'll say that this God is really the same thing as the Aten, and we're going to go with that, and I'm going to sell this idea to the Hebrews living in the Eastern Nile Delta, which is exactly what he did. And he led a handful of those people, maybe 100, maybe less, maybe 200, up through eastern Jordan, up into Canaan. So I think that's probably the way the Exodus actually happened. And in the process, of course, Moses being a priest, priests bargained with gods. What he did, he bargained with this God called Yahweh. He produced a covenant, which is the result of a bargain, and that's the covenant that we've known today. It was carried around in the Ark of the Covenant and that sort of thing, modeled after Egyptian contraptions, I might add. And so that's the way we leave it. Does this God Yahweh really exist? Well, if this God Yahweh is really the Aten, having been given a new name, and the Aten was created by the Pharaoh Akhenaten for the sole purpose really of bringing power to himself. You can make your own decision on that one, but I don't think that the evidence is very good. So, okay, let's go to the next one. What happened after ancient Judaism? Well, Christianity came out of Judaism, as practically everybody knows, and But Christianity is a different kind of God. It has a God consisting of three persons, as you probably know, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Where did it come from? Nothing like that ever existed anywhere, you know. And you say, well, this God revealed himself, you know, to the first Christians. And the first Christians then learned from that. And, well, maybe it didn't happen that way, you know. Maybe this God didn't reveal himself. Maybe he was the creation of a human being. And I have a hunch that that's probably true. And I think he is the creation of Paul the Apostle. Paul, as most of you know, if you know anything about Christianity, originally persecuted early Christians, and then he had this little experience of being knocked off his horse, and he then decided to convert to Christianity, and he became the second founder of Christianity. Practically everybody says that. If it weren't for Paul the Apostle, there wouldn't be any Christianity today. He was really the spearhead, the prime mover in this whole thing. And where did he get this idea then of a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Well, he says that he went to Arabia. You know, soon after he was knocked off his. Incidentally, was he really knocked off his horse? If he was, he would have written it down in his letters. The letters of Paul the Apostle are the first documents of early Christianity, and this would have been the most important event in the entire history of Paul's life. He would have referred to it in every single letter that he wrote. He doesn't refer to it at all. You know, it took Luke, the gospel writer Luke, in order to make some mention of it. So it's very unlikely that Paul was ever really knocked off his horse. But he did get the idea, you know, of becoming a supporter of Christianity, and I think that he went forward and did that. So, again, where did he get it? He says that after he was knocked off his horse, he went to Arabia. Now, where on earth is, well, everybody knows where Arabia is, but where did he go in Arabia? Well, he makes mention of Sinai. So people think, oh, he went to Sinai. I don't know if anybody's been to Sinai. I actually haven't, but I have been nearby there, and it's not really a very nice place. It's just in the summertime, blazing hot, lots of hot rocks, lots of hot sand, and that's about it. Why on earth would Paul have gone to Sinai? I don't think he went to Sinai. Where he went, I think, was to Alexandria, you know, which is on the western Nile Delta, the second largest city in the Roman Empire. The people in Alexandria spoke Greek, which was Paul's native language. It had the largest library, you've probably heard of the library in Alexandria, largest library of all of the Roman Empire. It was a ferment, you know, of Jewish thought. If you wanted to educate yourself, that's exactly where you would go. He could easily have gotten there if he traveled by boat from any major port city on the Mediterranean. And we know that Paul liked to travel by boat because he refers to it in his letter. Why didn't he go there? That's probably where he would have gone. And what would he have found there? Well, he would have found this, as I said, this ferment of Jewish thought. He would have found Gnosticism, which is a belief that says, it's a kind of a spin-off of Platonism, that says that the truth can be found within you. Now, if you've ever said anything about Plato, you know that Plato's, the knowledge of the forms for Plato is embedded in the mind, and knowledge or learning is simply a process of recollection. So this is what Paul would have found. He would have found Gnosticism, which is a combination of Hellenism, which is Plato. He would have found this super form, this super entity called the One, which didn't take too much thinking. You can make that into a father. He found Hermeticism, which says that the father really engaged in sex. It's strange, it produces a son. So you have a father producing a son, and then he would have encountered this book called the Wisdom of Solomon, which refers to the Holy Spirit. He would have found the three components of the Christian God: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I think that's what happened. He came back, introduced himself to the other apostles. They said, "Who are you?" They said, "Well, I'm Paul. I've had visions of Jesus, the visions of the risen Christ." You know, did he really have visions? Probably not. But he wanted to convince them that he was at least as good as they were, because they said, you've never even met the risen Christ. You've never met Jesus. You've had no contact with any of this stuff. How does it happen that you're so good? Well, he spent his whole life trying to convince them that he was as good as the rest of them. And so he started writing letters, and he was better than the other apostles because he could read and write. The others probably couldn't read anything, almost certainly couldn't write anything. So here is this man that comes along, can read and write. He can write letters to populations all over the Mediterranean, and he can convince them that they should become Christians. He anointed himself basically the Christian or the apostle of the Gentiles, and that's what he did. He converted Gentiles. And why Gentiles? There's a lot more Gentiles than there are Hebrews. So it's a very good idea if you want to convert people. Why would he have wanted to convert people? Because he dreamed up this idea that he was going to have a very high place in the kingdom of heaven. This idea that the kingdom of heaven is right around the corner, is going to happen very soon. All I have to do is get lots of converts. I will be appointed in some very high position, a viceroy or something in the kingdom of heaven, and I will live happily ever after. I'll have everything I've ever wanted. I think that's exactly what he did. But so in all of his letters, he refers to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, he refers to Jesus, the Son of God, and so on. That's where it came from. I think it came from Paul the Apostle. He invented it. And how did he get the idea for it? He got the idea for it by going to Alexandria and learning about these things that were happening there. But he laid an egg that turned out to be a monster, because after Paul died, people wondered, what are these things? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Are they gods? Are they independently existing things? Do we have three gods then? Well, we're supposed to be a monotheistic religion. How can you have monotheism when you've got three gods, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? And how do they relate to one another? Is the Son the creation of the Father? Is the Father then older than the Son? Is the Father superior to the Son? What is the Holy Spirit? And we still don't know what the Holy Spirit is. There's practically no explanation for it anywhere. So the bishops, the early bishops, the successors of the apostles, struggled with these questions for 300 years. And they could never come up with an answer, because it looks like they're dealing with a contradiction. And I think they are dealing with a contradiction, because 3 is not the same as 1. But they struggled with it. And then they set up this council, the Council of Nicaea. You may have heard of it, one of the most famous councils in all of Christian thinking. And that was in 325 CE. And they tried to settle this issue. And a man by the name of Constantine was there, and he was really interested in settling this issue as to what is the religion, of the area. And if there was a single religion with a single God, and if we could figure out what that God was, then he, Constantine, would be in an excellent position in order to serve as emperor. So he was the one who really paid the bill for the Council of Nicaea. He paid the way for all the bishops to come there and settle this thing. And he even suggested that why don't you use the Aristotelian concept of substance to say that the Christian God consists of a single substance. And that word appears in the Creed, amazingly. But they never did figure out how you can have 3 persons with one substance. Some bishops came up with the idea, why don't you call 3 persons hypostases, and call the one God the one God a substance, the 3 persons hypostases, and make them get away with it that way. And in fact, some of them said, without the concept of hypostasy, you'll never be able to answer this question. Whenever anybody tells you in philosophy, without this one idea, you're never going to be able to solve the problem, it's pulling over your eyes. It never works, okay? And here's the clincher. The word hypostasis means exactly the same thing in Greek that the word substance means in Latin. So you've got 3 substances together with one substance. You're going to answer the problem? No. The problem of 3 persons in one God was never answered, and it has not been answered since. So, but anyway, they claimed to have done it. They did it through political power. The power of Constantine came to play. Constantine settled on the suggestion that he made, that we've got one substance, we've got three hypostases, and he became emperor of the entire region, one of the most important of the Roman emperors. And he did it, you know, by settling this issue of the Trinity, to the satisfaction, you know, of many of the bishops that were there. Didn't settle anything, but he persuaded them that it had been settled. So that's basically the way we lead it. Power has been an essential component of religion all the way along the line. The power of the priests in ancient Egypt created the gods. They maintained this whole structure, you know, of the afterlife and so on. The power of the ancient con artists going back 12,000 years who persuaded their people, you know, that they could communicate with the gods, and they became more powerful as a result of it. The power of Moses to convince this group of people, you know, to go up and follow him in the Exodus, and go along with him. That's a product of power. The power of Moses to create Yahweh, and it made Moses a very powerful individual indeed. Then the power of the bishop, the power of Paul the Apostle, the power of the bishop to create the Christian God, and the Christian God was really the creation of bishops, I think, through the Council of Nicaea. Now, there was a couple of interesting consequences that I came across.
Richard, maybe 5 more minutes and then we can have a conversation.
Oh, okay, good.
Keep track of time.
The first one, the Exodus, as we've already mentioned, was a smaller and of shorter duration. Did Moses really lead a group of people out of Egypt to escape from the clutches of Pharaoh? That's the way the story is told. You know, Pharaoh had enslaved these people, and Moses came along with a bunch of plagues and settled these plagues upon the people of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh didn't want to let the people go, but finally it got to be so bad that he decided to let them go. Okay, what really happened here? Think of it this way. The Egyptian people were terrified of one thing more than anything else. They were terrified of monotheism. They were terrified of the monotheism of Akhenaten, who lived just 100 years before. They were terrified of the Aten, the one God who had absorbed all the other gods and destroyed the afterlife. So along comes a man, Moses, and he's a monotheist, and he's going to lead a bunch of monotheists out of Egypt to escape the clutches of Pharaoh. What would the Egyptian people? They would have raised up and driven them out. They wanted to be rid of these monotheists more than anything else. And if the Pharaoh even knew about any Moses, he would have said, good riddance to bad rubbish. I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. I'm not going to lift a finger, you know, to persuade these people to stay. I want them gone. So the Exodus, far from being a daring escape, was very likely an expulsion, and I think that was probably the case. And we're about to celebrate the festival, of course, of the escape from Egypt, what's the word the Passover on April 23rd, I think, celebrates the escape from Egypt. Well, it probably wasn't an escape; it was probably an expulsion. The other one relates to Christianity. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, the evidence for it is really skimpy. If you look in the Bible, there's a few sightings after Jesus' death. What probably really happened? Well, Jesus, assuming he existed, and I think there's good evidence that he did exist, put to death by the Romans. Why was he put to death? Because he was an insurrectionist. He claimed that he was the king of the Jews, and the only person who can appoint a king, of course, is the emperor. So this was not good at all. So the best thing to do, and the Romans were always a little bit worried of a revolution, a revolt. So better to nip this thing in the bud and take this man Jesus and crucify him, which they did. And what was the purpose of crucifixion? To terrorize the Jews, to make sure they don't revolt. And how would they do that? Well, they would crucify a man, they would leave him on the cross for as long as they possibly could until the flesh was rotting, okay, was then eaten up by carrion birds and eaten up by dogs. And that's probably what happened, in the case of Jesus. Why would they allow anyone to take him down from the cross? There's no reason at all. That was part of the whole thing. So, as the story goes, well, some women came along and looked into a tomb, and they found that the tomb is empty, right? Marvelous. He must have risen. Well, he was never put into a tomb in the first place. So, of course, the tomb was empty. What do you think? So what probably really happened? Well, what was left of him after the dogs and the birds had their way? The remainder was just taken down and thrown into a common grave. And that's what they did with all the people that they crucified. So probably that's what happened in the case of Jesus. How does it happen then that we think that he rose from the dead? Millions, billions of people today think that Jesus rose from the dead. And I think the answer is that there was a period of 40 years between the time when Jesus died, around 30 in the common area, the year 30, and when the first gospel was written. It was around 70, the Gospel of Mark. So there's a period of 40 years when the beliefs of Christianity were memories. That's all they were, just memories. There were no magazines, there was no photographs, there were no newspapers, no nothing. No permanent records of anything. There was nobody to follow Jesus around and write down what he said. Didn't have a stenographer. So it was only a memory. And memory, we're talking about collective memory. The way collective memory works, and I think it's been pretty well settled, collective memory works, the things that are remembered are the things that you need to survive. What did the early Christians need to survive as a group of people, as a movement? We need a king, okay, and we need a living king. So very, very easily, the memory of Jesus switched, from being a man that died on the cross to being a man that rose from the dead after 3 days. And I think there's lots of ways that this could have happened, and I talk about it, in this book quite a bit, if you're interested. So we want to ask a few questions. But do we have only 5 minutes for questions? Or?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
We've got 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if anybody has a comment, a thought, or an argument. This is not uncontentious material.
No. Probably good Christians are horrified by what I was a good Christian at one time, and I believed all this stuff really very fervently when I was a little kid. But too many questions tend to erode my beliefs. One of them, you believe contradictions. 3 is 1. That's a tough one, So, anybody else have any thoughts about this stuff? Yes.
Yeah. Could you go back to your Paul slide real quick? I was just confused on your point of him going to Alexandria instead of the other place where it's documented.
Into Sinai.
Yeah. So, were you saying it was because the weather was nicer and he spoke the language and there was a library there?
Yeah, well, there's no reason to go to Sinai. Paul mentions Sinai in the same passage where he says he went to Arabia. So people think, oh, he must have gone to Sinai. But when you think about it, why on earth would he have gone to Sinai? It doesn't make a bit of sense, and it makes much more sense for a person who is interested in furthering his education. And he wants to further his education because he wants to become a leader of the incipient Christian movement. Go to some place that's going to educate him. And the greatest center of education in the entire world was Alexandria, and that's in Arabia. Okay, why not say he went there? And I haven't had anybody respond to this. Nobody has written me emails or anything saying, "Oh, you're all washed up." Nobody has said a thing about it. But I think that's probably why he went there. Spoke his language. It was a center of education. It had the largest Jewish component of any city in the Roman Empire. There was lots of reasons, for him to have gone to Alexandria, and he would have encountered this group of Gnostics there. And a lot of people agree that Paul was a Gnostic. Elaine,
Pagels.
Elaine Pagels, you probably heard of Elaine Pagels, wrote a book, The Gnostic Paul. How did Paul become and I think he was. And Elaine Pagels makes more sense of the Apostle Paul than anybody else. How would he have learned about Gnosticism? He would have learned about it in Alexandria, which was the center of Gnosticism. See, so many pieces fit together, if you say that. I don't have any definitive evidence. I don't have any letter from Paul that says I went to Alexandria. He was kind of secretive about a lot of things that he did. But anyway, that's the reason why I think he probably went
Man,
there.
what do you think?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what I know from like the tracking of Paul's journey through his letters and what's written in there. And I was just wondering where, like, what you're using to support that point, because it's just something I hadn't heard before as a point to where Paul might have gone. And then I was also just looking at, I had a couple of questions. So you were saying that Paul's letters were for him to try to convert the Gentiles and stuff. What do you make of his letters then that are just to address the churches that he started instead of just for conversion?
I'm sorry, so what do I make of the
She wants to know, Paul wrote letters to the individual churches, right?
Yes.
And so what do you make of those letters?
Well, they're congregations.
I know,
And
but
he's got to keep them in his fold. You know, he's got to keep writing them so they don't drift off. He wants to claim these people as his converts, because when he dies and goes up to heaven, he's going to be able to tell Jesus, who sits at the right hand of the Father, look at all these converts that I've got for you, you know? And there is a statement in the gospel that has Jesus saying, you know, go out and convert all nations. And that did Jesus really ever say anything like that? Probably not. But it got put into the gospels. And so Paul is going to go up there. Look at what wonderful work I've done for you. You've got to make me, you know, got to give me a very high position in this kingdom. And I think that's probably what he did. That's what drove him, you know.
So you're counting his letters then to the churches that he started as like him trying to convert Gentiles. That's what you're looking at when you're making that claim. I just want to make sure that was what you were arguing in this. So when you're looking at the letters of Paul that he's writing to the churches he started, you're saying that was him trying to convert the Gentiles if you were like through what your argument is.
I don't know if I got the whole thing. So I have a hearing deficit, so. What?
So she's saying, look, these are established churches. Is that it, Amanda?
Yeah.
And so and you're saying that Paul is trying to convert Gentiles, right?
Well, he
And
already
so why is
converted.
he
He already
writing
converted
to
these people,
established
but he wanted to
churches?
keep them converted. He didn't want people to drift
Okay.
away. And in order to keep them converted, write letters to him. And he was a great letter writer, and a pretty good writer too, you know.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because that was something I was a little confused about. And then you were talking about the collective memory of
Yes.
the Christians, and that's how they spread it. What do you make of like the oral tradition that they talked about, and all the research that goes into that in the creation of the Bible and the Gospels, and kind of the study of those communities that the Gospels were written for through oral tradition? Are you saying that that's not as valid as written tradition?
No, I think the oral tradition existed.
Yeah.
And that was the tradition. That was Christianity for the first 40 years. There was nothing written, you know, before
Yeah.
Paul got on there. Well, Paul was writing, but Paul says nothing basically about what Jesus was like. There's nothing biographical about Jesus in the letters of Paul. So in order to find any biographical details, you got to go to the Gospel of Mark, you know, first gospel written, and that's 40 years later. So what happens to memory? Memory is going to change. I mean, the people remember that died 10 years ago. You know, we have different memories of them. You know that.
Yeah.
Like Martin Luther King, for example, people remember him differently today than people remembered him right before he was killed. Memory shifts and it drifts and it evolves, and I think it evolves according to the same pattern of evolution as biological evolution. And I think there's good reason for that. You have mutant memories that pop up. Okay, these mutant memories become examined for the purpose of whether they're adaptable or not. Okay, just like biological genes, you know, are sized up basically on their adaptability. And if these genes are adaptable, they become part of the species. Okay, well, memories become part of what's de facto remembered. You know, depending upon what is adaptable. What do you mean adaptable? Whatever it is that fosters, that furthers the survival of the movement. Same thing, whatever further the survival of the biological species. So there's a direct analogy there for collective memory, an analogy between memory and biological evolution. If a mutant memory fosters the survival of the group, and we're talking about the nascent group of Christians, if it fosters the survival of that group, that's what's going to be remembered. And I think that's exactly why we remember Jesus as having arisen from the dead, and the story doesn't end with his dying on the cross. So,
Yeah.
I think we got like 2 more minutes.
Oh, yeah.
I think. Anybody else have a question?
Real quick, can I ask a
Yeah.
clarifying question?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
you're a
Sorry,
very
yeah.
rapt participant in this audience.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
just
very
had-
much.
I want to make sure I had this right for my paper. But so when you're looking at the evolution of memory, which is definitely a valid point, in conjunction with like oral tradition, what do you make of like the arguments that could say because the oral tradition and the validity of that was preserved, would that help correct any mutant memories, or what do you think about all of that?
I don't know if I got that one. What was it?
She wants to know if the oral
My
tradition,
wife.
the oral tradition it could be like self-corrective, right?
Well, yeah, so if you're claiming there's like validity in the oral tradition, it's passed down, it's okay, but then you're saying there's also like the evolution of human memory, how does the oral tradition then play into that and maybe correcting mutant memories? Like, have you had that as a counter argument?
So is mutant, is memory, collective memory, is it self-correcting?
No.
Oh.
Is the oral tradition that is being passed down for the first 40 years, is that able to correct the collective memory?
Does it, well, it changes collective memory. You see, here's the thing, how do you correct something when there's no record, you know?
Well, it would be through the oral tradition that's being passed down. Does that play into?
Yeah, but it's the oral tradition that's evolving, you know?
Okay, so you're saying it's evolving over time. That's where I wanted.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
The oral
gotcha.
tradition evolved, and it continues to evolve, right? And it even evolved after there were written records. Continued to evolve, you know. So the evolution of corrective memory, I think, answers an awful lot of questions that existed in the case of early Christianity. And the same thing for early Judaism. I mean, there was a period of 600 years or so before a lot of these things happened until they were written down by the Levites, you know, right after the period in Babylon. So they have a huge lengthy period of oral tradition and collective memory. Now, we did probably have some documents in Judaism because they were writers, they were educated, they knew how to write, but a lot of it was remembered. And the stuff of, for example, there's a story about the conquest, you know, following the Exodus, and the Jews came across a town called Jericho, and Joshua blew his horn, and the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. Well, we've proven to a certainty that there were no walls in Jericho at that time, okay? So the walls couldn't have come tumbling down. How is it remembered? Collective memory. Because it's such a great story. It shows that Yahweh loves us, and he caused the walls to come tumbling down. Well, if there weren't any walls, same thing for the plagues in Egypt. If there were no plagues, there's no reason for Yahweh. The plagues are cited for the purpose of showing how Yahweh loves us, you know, and that's what Passover is all about. Celebrate the love of Yahweh for the Jewish people. But if there were no plagues, there's no need for Yahweh, okay? If there's no walls around Jericho, there's no need for any Yahweh to make them come tumbling down. So this sort of thing goes over and over. There's lots of examples of it, you know. So